the end user, the lens of those impacted into that development life cycle. The checks and balances have to be built in from the start.
Um, and I agree with this. I just want to say this just as a participant and just person here. This is a great panel. Like, I'm not kidding. I'm learning a lot right now, and everybody in here is super knowledgeable. So I just wanted to say that I'm actually honored and happy to be here and I'm learning. Now, the other element of how do we make this change? I think that there are a couple of examples we can look at, and then probably I would say 4 organizations where I feel like the people in this panel could really lend their expertise combined with people who already have voices and microphones. So I think when you look at the campaign of Andrew Yang, he put the issue of what AI is going to do, at least into labor and the employment sector, squarely on the table. That was his entire platform. And he focused on truck drivers and what autonomous driving would do to truck drivers. So I think that he has an organization called Venture for America that could use the voices in this room. I'm not talking about his political operation. I'm talking about his nonprofit, Venture for America, where it could use the voices in this room and people who are interested. So he has the microphone, and then people here have a domain expertise, and then they would have the opportunity to help him focus on some things that are very specific to their company and their vertical. Because a lot of times that air cover, I think that one of the panelists mentioned that before, makes it a lot easier for you to go into your corporation and say, we need to make these changes when there's pressure from the outside. The second group that I think that people with domain expertise in AI should get involved with is would be the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, because they're actually real-time litigating these issues. Same thing with the ACLU. I'm not talking politics, I'm talking rights and civil liberties. They're litigating these exact issues real time, and they're getting wins at the city and the state and the federal level. But they could use domain expertise, people who are inside who understand what their technologies are doing. The example that I would give, historical example, would be comparable to academics with the Manhattan Project and the development of the nuclear bomb. You know, everybody went into it. I know Richard Feynman went into it saying, well, if the bomb is theoretically possible, then it's practically inevitable. And ethically, he decided it's better for us to get the bomb before the Nazis got the bomb. And then that's the reason why he joined. Once after the fact, and he saw the impact of nuclear bomb, it's like, wait, we dropped on Japan. We got into this for Nazis. Once he realized, you know, kind of the way the military industrial complex at the time used his brain power and the impact of the technology, he became part of what ultimately became the Union of Concerned Scientists. And then academics got involved, and then they began to consult with interest groups, pressure groups, legislative bodies, and help them explain how the technology worked and why it needed to be the most regulated technology in the history of the earth. And I think that there's going to have to be that kind of inside outside game where people who have the expertise on the technology pair up with people who have the microphones and the ability to evangelize and the ability to mobilize citizens to demand transparency and accountability to stop some of the worst effects. This is definitely true for diversity and integration, but just like integration benefited every citizen, when you focus on diversity, in this case, in the current moment, African Americans, it will preserve civil liberties, rights, and opportunities for everyone.
So I have another question. So everyone has biases. How do we check our own biases as makers of technology? And what do you see the role of AI being in the future? I mean, what is the use or what is the role of AI in our society? So Justin, do you want to give any thoughts on that?
Sure. So kind of starting with the end of the question first, I think that regardless of what we want the role to be of AI in society, it's going to be a major impact probably forever now. So what that means to us is that during, as many people said, during the design process, during the development process, even during ideation, we have a pretty strong responsibility to incorporate learnings from multiple fields. And I think someone mentioned earlier that social sciences, actually is a really great plus up to our skill sets as practitioners and developers. What I found in Yelp in particular is that we have to train ourselves as practitioners. We have to train ourselves as designers and developers. So as scientists, it's easier because we have the ability to just go to archive, look at a paper, bring that into our practice and consider it. For the business, it's been a little bit more challenging because, as we identified earlier, everyone's trying to optimize for speed. But what we can do as a part of our own power as people who are in the field is incorporate that into our decks, incorporate that into our design reviews, into our code reviews. And so one of the things we've done is that when there's a development process going on and we're going through a CR, you actually have right in the Jira board, it's built in automatically that you have to pass an ethics check and you have to pass a diversity check. And so we do this at each level of the development process. So there's data. So someone with that expertise is going to need to be found. If you're working on housing data and you don't have domain experience there, you have to go get someone who does. If you're working on user information, then you need probably to get someone from user research because that's where their domain expertise lies. As you move forward into the sort of feature design and machine learning testing process, we actually have statisticians as well as people who are closer to the algorithmic side of things who need to add some of those interpretability tools I talked about before. So for example, one of them is SHAP, if you're working on like high dimensional data. So like if you're working on potentially an NLP task, that's something that can give you some insight into actually which features are contributing to what the model's inference task is going to be. So we've got people who know how to read that. And if we don't, we need to go get it. That's actually a requirement for us to be able to deploy, right? And that means Yelp may have to go buy it from someone else's expertise in a consultancy, or we have to hire some people who have that domain expertise. And then, of course, as you get farther down the development cycle, you start thinking about user design, the user's perspective and how they're going to consume this in the actual product. Of course, product research, user research are the ones really leading the charge there. And they have a very specific expertise that's typically more qualitative, but certainly the most impactful because they're the last people before users are going to actually consume it. So that really just is laying out how many people have to touch this problem and how important that each one of those people have specific domain experience around how these issues are going to impact the product. And if you're thinking this is probably really expensive or this is going to take a long time, I would just point you to some of the recent failures of AI systems around bias in particular. They cost a lot more than implementing this process. Cleaning that up, I promise you it did. And so from an executive perspective, which is kind of where I have the privilege to sit, a lot of my conversations are, hey, making sure when someone comes up with a great idea that we get it into this right workflow, because it's my responsibility to protect the company in some sense from going too fast and from deploying things without these tools in place. So that would be how I would approach that.
I'll speak to the bias checking. So I think as a leader, you're responsible for understanding and reflecting and being self-aware enough to know that you have your biases. Full stop. It is also your responsibility to build a board of advisors that keeps you in check, which echoes Justin's sentiment. That board of advisors should have diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, diversity of function, so that your biases can be kept in check.
Yeah, I'd just like to add from a perspective of someone who does this every day, it's the same responsibility. We have to think about this and think about our blind spots. Not only that, but sometimes it does take consulting with people who aren't like us to point these out. That's something that I've personally had to do in the past, but taking that extra time to make sure we're not excluding groups of people. and we're not baking these prejudices that already exist in society straight into our models. It really does come to relying on other people because there are some things we just can't see.
Yeah, I want to echo what everyone else said. I think the key is getting it into the workflows, and I just want to highlight, something else too. Like, I hope the attendees really appreciate that it's very rare that you get in, you have this type of discussion with African Americans who are actually in leadership positions who can put diversity into the workflow. They're and I don't have any problem with the D&I, position. But if it doesn't get into the workflow, it won't get into the technology. If it doesn't get into the technology, it won't change the culture. That's it. Now and I think the other people here are kind of in a fortunate situation where, and we're smaller too. We only have 250 people, but our CEO has made it a priority that everyone in the company implement our ethics framework, and it's in the workflow. So I see there are a couple questions in the Q&A about how that works and how you get it into the organizations. Well, basically, we're primarily a consultancy with an R&D arm. So for us, it works like this: we get an RFP, or we get a business problem or a technical problem from a client. When we get that problem, then everyone who's involved in that use case, potentially, whether it's DevOps, engineers, data scientists, R&D, everyone in strategy, everyone who will have a part on that project will then come up with a whole range of technical solutions or business solutions. Once we get that set of technical and business solutions, then every one of those has to be vetted by our framework. So when we vet all those through our ethical framework, and diversity obviously is part of that, and society, and thinking broadly about society is part of that, which includes everybody, then those technical and business solutions are then vetted, go through an ethical reasoning process that we call top of mind ethics. Whatever's left is what we present back to the client. Usually, once we go through that vetting process, it makes our teams more creative, because now they think about a broader range of stakeholders, which then causes them to think more broadly about the potential solutions. So it should result in better, to Justin's point, more robust solutions that we present back to the client. So in our case, ethics doesn't have to be the priority for the client, because you're going to get an ethical solution whether you like it or not, because we vet it internally before we present it back to them as a potential solution. That's an important consideration, when you're, especially for us in an entrepreneurial environment where every client matters, every sale is important. We don't want to lose business, but we think that it helps us gain business, because all we have to do is point to the headlines and say this exact use case and this exact technology has cost other people money when it wasn't vetted because it blew up on them. Our solution ultimately will be more robust. It will last. It will withstand scrutiny, and it will withstand accountability. So that's kind of the way we implement it into our workflow. And I want to make a really important point that ties back to what I said about the people on this panel. I'm assuming that they're in a position that they can flat out stop a use case and say, listen, nope, doesn't pass muster, not happening. When developers, designers, data scientists, and R&D know they can't run you over, they think differently. All of a sudden, everybody becomes a freaking philosopher. Everybody's a social scientist. Somehow or another, they figured out how to think about people when they know that their work will not go forward. And I think that's critically important. And this is the last thing I'll say, and I always say this because people say, well, at my company, we X, Y, and Z. Okay, quit that company. If your company is a loser, it will be a net negative on your resume. All these years and time you spend on that company, you will not be able to tell that story in the future. This is an extreme example, but if you were a general in the SS, I'm sorry, that's not a credential. Not impressed. You were on the wrong side of everything. So quit that company and go find another company that does believe in their obligations to society, and where you can be innovative and where you can make the world a better place. I firmly believe that this may be the best career advice you get, at least this morning.
That's wonderful. Well, I would say, just to underscore the subtext there, is if you have a values-driven organization, you're able to execute against this. If you have clearly defined values that you commit to, that you build into the way that you build your product, then you can deliver against this initiative. And another thing that you can apply to this is sort of understanding and recognizing that the guardrails of diversity and inclusion in AI, it's not a boundary, but it's a tool to allow you to be more creative so that you can play in that space. The analog that I like to use is, what is tennis without a fence around it? It's a game of chase, and that is no fun for anybody, right? But once you have the boundary of the fence, you can actually keep the ball in play. And so how do we keep the ball in play? With the boundaries, with the guardrails that we're trying to put into place, with applying ethics to AI. I'm excited for the game.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I feel like one of the really nice and unique parts of working in AI is that typically, if you are in engineering, product tends to directly guide engineering. Whereas with AI technologies, we're able to guide a lot of guide a lot of product as well. So having that impact, I always say the biggest skill you need for anyone in data science or AI is being skeptical and not being afraid to be the squeaky wheel and say, no, we don't think this is a good product. Going forward, we can look at our data and say, this is just going to reinforce our bias, and basically use these data-driven metrics that every company wants to use as far as making those decisions to guide those decisions in the right direction.
Crystal, panelists, this has been a great conversation. I hesitate to interrupt, but this is a great time to open it up to the wider group, the audience that has been watching live, and we'll have that conversation here for those who have access. So I'll ask the team to open it up now, and I think they'll be coming in here shortly. I do see a couple of questions in the Q&A that may still be there. I think we've answered two. There's one more if you wanted to get to that. But Crystal and the panelists are doing such a great job. I've been taking notes, so feel free to continue to engage the folks as they come in.
Yeah, we have a question here. Can you please share an example of a technical solution that did not go through ethical and diversity evaluation criterion?
I can give some examples. One, broadly, every single facial recognition program sold to every single law enforcement agency in the United States and around the world, none vetted. That's the reason why you have such economic value loss. Consider this: if you work at IBM on computer vision for the last 10 years, you just watch your work go up in smoke. Period. Same at Amazon, same at Microsoft. So that's one. That's everywhere. Everyone knows that. Second one, and this is the first case prosecuted by the Department of Justice, which was a company called Practice Fusion. It was a Kleiner Perkins backed company. Well, everybody got called in, and I just bring up Kleiner because they're the biggest brand. They raised $150 million. The company was digitizing physician practice groups. So if you had these practice groups had between 50 to 500 patients. They rolled up enough practice groups to have the electronic health records on 5 million patients. Once they got these electronic health records, then they began to run machine intelligence on the records and then look at that patient journeys. And then they honed in on their prescription journeys. So as they went through the process, what was their diagnosis, and what prescriptions did they get? Based on what they learned from other practice groups and patterns, they began to do what are called nudges, and they began to recommend back to individual doctors prescription and treatment plans for patients that came from data outside of their medical group. What they didn't disclose to the doctor groups was that they were actually being paid by pharmaceutical companies, and Johnson & Johnson in particular, to recommend the prescription of opioids